Heinz Guderian, known as the architect of Blitzkrieg, once wrote near the end of his life, "I cannot stay silent anymore." These words opened his final memoir, Panzer Leader, a book that became much more than a record of war tactics. It was an effort to explain, justify, and, in some ways, confess. In its pages, Guderian forced the world to face a difficult truth: the fine line between brilliance and obedience, between loyalty and conscience in the chaos of war. What he revealed about his choices and his regrets left the world both fascinated and unsettled. Heinz Wilhelm Guderian was no ordinary soldier. Born in 1888 in Chaum, then part of the German Empire, he came from a military family that valued discipline, loyalty, and innovation. From a young age, he was trained to think strategically and to question limitations. By the end of World War I, he had already made a name for himself as a sharp analyst in military communication and logistics. But his greatest transformation came in the years between the two world wars. The Treaty of Versailles had left Germany's army crippled by restrictions. Most officers saw these limits as obstacles. Guderian saw them as an opportunity to think differently. He became obsessed with speed, coordination, and the future of mechanized warfare. In the 1920s and 1930s, when Germany was not even allowed to build tanks openly, Guderian studied and experimented with ideas that would change modern combat forever. He read every book he could find on warfare, especially the works of British theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart, who had written about the potential of armored vehicles. But Guderian was not a copycat. He had his own vision. He believed tanks should not simply support the infantry, but lead the battle itself. He saw them as the main weapon of victory. From these ideas came the concept that would shock the world: Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It was a strategy built on speed, surprise, and power, using tanks, airplanes, and motorized infantry working together to strike quickly and overwhelm the enemy before they could react. When World War II began, Guderian's theories moved from paper to the battlefield. His armored divisions tore through Poland in 1939, then stormed through France in 1940. The world had never seen warfare move so fast. Cities fell within days, and defenses that were expected to last months crumbled almost overnight. Guderian became a legend, admired for his strategic genius both inside and outside Germany. But fame in Nazi Germany came with a dangerous price. His success made him vital to Hitler's plans, and that made him a target of politics and ideology. Guderian was not a member of the Nazi Party and often found himself at odds with Hitler's impulsive decisions. Yet he was also a loyal soldier, sworn to obey. This conflict between duty and morality would define the rest of his life. After the war ended, his reputation became complicated. The man who helped build Germany's most feared war machine was also one of its most outspoken critics of Hitler's interference. When captured by the Allies, he was interrogated not only about his tactics but about his moral choices. Released from detention in 1948, he found a world that no longer saw him as a military hero, but as someone who had lived through, and perhaps enabled, one of history's darkest chapters. In 1952, 2 years before his death, he published Panzer Leader. It was his last chance to tell his story, to explain what he had done and why. The book was both a defense and an act of reflection. He tried to preserve his legacy as a military innovator while confronting, in his own way, the moral weight of his actions. Historians have argued ever since whether he succeeded in telling the truth or simply reshaped his image to protect it. But one thing is certain: Guderian refused to die in silence. He wanted the world to understand what it meant to be the creator of a weapon that changed war forever. When he began writing Panzer Leader, Guderian was not just recounting battles. He was trying to shape how history would remember him. The tone of the book is both analytical and personal, the words of a man caught between pride and guilt. After years in captivity and interrogation, he wrote with precision, not propaganda. It was the voice of a commander trying to make sense of chaos, both the chaos of the battlefield and the confusion of conscience that followed. He presented himself not as a politician or ideologue, but as a professional soldier, devoted to reason and discipline. "There are no desperate situations," he once wrote, "only desperate people." This phrase summed up his worldview: logical, calm, and focused on control. For Guderian, hesitation was weakness, and indecision was defeat. His belief in discipline and order became his armor against the emotional turmoil of war. In his book, Soldiers Are Instruments of Duty, Not Ideology, he described war in terms of movement, coordination, and timing, not in terms of right or wrong. He portrayed himself as a professional who tried to keep politics out of warfare. Yet beneath the careful words, there is tension. His constant insistence that he was only following orders, and his effort to separate himself from the political crimes of the regime reveal a man still defending himself, years after the guns went silent. At times, Guderian's writing shifts between pride and restraint. He admired the technical skill and coordination of his panzer forces, their ability to strike quickly and decisively. But he did not glorify destruction. His admiration for precision and control is often shadowed by frustration with Hitler's impulsive commands and lack of strategic sense. The book subtly criticizes the Nazi leadership without directly attacking it, reflecting Guderian's lifelong struggle between obedience and opposition. In Panzer Leader, every sentence feels carefully chosen, as if he knew his legacy would be judged by historians and soldiers alike. He believed that facts, if presented clearly, could protect him from moral condemnation. But Panzer Leader is not just a technical manual, it is a window into Guderian's mind. It reveals a man trying to reconcile his brilliance with the consequences of what that brilliance had unleashed. To understand his legacy, one must first understand the world he built, the world of Blitzkrieg. In the interwar years, while Germany was forbidden from developing new weapons, Guderian and a small circle of officers secretly worked on new strategies for mechanized warfare. He envisioned fast, coordinated attacks led by tanks instead of infantry. His belief was that war should be won by movement and surprise, not by slow, grinding trench battles like in World War I. He wrote, "The goddess of victory bestows her laurels only on those who act with daring." One of Guderian's most revolutionary ideas was the use of radios in every tank. This allowed entire armored units to communicate and move as one, creating an unstoppable force. His campaigns in Poland and France proved how effective this could be. Armies that expected to hold out for weeks fell in days. To Guderian, this was not luck. It was proof of his theory that speed and coordination could win wars faster than brute strength. Yet as he looked back later in life, he also acknowledged the cost. Blitzkrieg was not just a tactic, it was an obsession that demanded perfection from men and machines. Tanks broke down, soldiers grew exhausted, supply lines collapsed under the pressure of such fast movements. The same system that made Germany unstoppable at first also made it fragile. When Hitler invaded Russia in 1941, the vast distances, harsh winters, and endless resistance shattered the illusion of unstoppable speed. Still, Guderian never abandoned his faith in mechanized warfare. In his memoir, he blamed failures on political interference, especially Hitler's refusal to listen to professional advice. This brings us to one of the most revealing parts of his book, his conflict with Hitler and the German High Command. In Panzer Leader, Guderian describes his growing frustration with how decisions were made in Berlin. At first, he respected Hitler's confidence and drive. But over time, he saw how the dictator's intuition replaced logic. Orders were given without understanding the reality on the front lines. Guderian recalled endless meetings where he argued for reason and strategy, while Hitler dismissed him with impatience. During Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, these tensions exploded. Guderian wanted to strike directly toward Moscow, believing that capturing the Soviet capital quickly could end the war. Hitler overruled him, diverting troops toward the south to chase resources. The result was chaos and delay. By the time the German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow, winter had arrived, and the offensive collapsed. Guderian's army suffered enormous losses, and he was dismissed from command in December 1941. In Panzer Leader, he describes this moment not with anger, but with a cold clarity. He saw his dismissal as both political and personal. He claimed he had accepted difficult positions only to protect the soldiers and prevent senseless losses. His words suggest both pride and sorrow. A man who tried to do the right thing but was trapped in a system driven by ego and ideology. When he returned to service in 1943 as Inspector General of Armored Troops, the situation was already beyond repair. Germany was running out of fuel, tanks, and men. The war machine he had built was falling apart. In his later reflections, Guderian tried to show himself as a voice of reason, a professional soldier who had opposed Hitler's disastrous choices. Historians still debate how sincere this was. Some see him as a brilliant tactician who refused to face the moral reality of the regime he served. Others view him as a military genius caught in a system he could not control. By the time Panzer Leader was published, Guderian was a man looking back on a world he had helped create and destroy. His words carry both pride and guilt. He never fully condemned the war, but his writing is haunted by the awareness of what it had become. The same intelligence that built Blitzkrieg was forced in the end to confront its consequences. Guderian's final message was not one of victory or glory, but of reckoning. He had spent his life perfecting the art of fast, decisive warfare. But in his final years, he understood that speed could not outrun responsibility. His memoir was his attempt to make peace with history, even if history never fully forgave him. And as he wrote those final lines, "I cannot stay silent anymore," the world listened to a man who had once changed war itself, now speaking not as a conqueror, but as a witness to what that conquest had cost. Heinz Guderian's final words and reflections have continued to spark debate for decades. Whether his memoir Panzer Leader was an honest attempt to face the truth or a carefully written effort to protect his image remains uncertain. But one thing is clear: the book gives readers a rare look inside the crumbling heart of the Third Reich, seen through the eyes of one of its most brilliant generals. In its pages, the once confident architect of Blitzkrieg transforms into a weary observer, watching the destruction of the very system he helped create. His story isn't filled with drama or emotion, but his calm tone hides a deep weight, the kind that only someone who has seen too much can carry. After its release, many wondered whether Guderian's memoir was written to set the record straight or simply to wash his hands of guilt. He had avoided being convicted as a war criminal because there wasn't enough evidence against him. Yet some believed Panzer Leader was his way of stepping away from the horrors his army had supported without ever taking responsibility for them. The book, on the surface, is about tanks, battles, and strategy. But beneath the maps and operations, there's something else, a quiet struggle. Guderian wrestled with the meaning of obedience, duty, and conscience. He tried to show himself as the perfect professional soldier, concerned only with movement, logistics, and precision. His focus was on machines and men, not politics. But what stands out more than what he wrote is what he left out. He described the hardships of his soldiers, the bitter cold, sleepless nights, and endless exhaustion, but said almost nothing about the civilians caught in the chaos, nor about the atrocities that occurred near his command. His silence spoke volumes. It revealed either a refusal to acknowledge the moral cost of his actions or a deep discomfort he couldn't bring himself to put into words. Historians have long noticed these gaps. They argue that the power of Panzer Leader lies not in the story it tells, but in the story it avoids. Guderian carefully separated himself from politics, insisting he was just a soldier following orders. He believed that moral responsibility belonged to the political leaders, not the army. This idea, the belief in a clean German army untainted by Nazi crimes, became one of the most controversial parts of his legacy. After the Nuremberg trials, readers found it difficult to accept that any soldier could have remained purely professional in such a system. Many saw his insistence on discipline and duty as a form of denial, a refusal to confront the truth of what the war had done. Others sensed something more complicated. A man who believed in order and hierarchy but came to realize, far too late, the consequences of blind obedience. As the book moves toward its later chapters, Guderian's writing shifts. His criticism of Hitler becomes sharper, but it's always focused on tactics and leadership, never morality. He doesn't call Hitler evil. He calls him foolish, impulsive, and strategically incompetent. His complaints are about misused tanks and failed offensives, not about genocide or ideology. He frames his opposition to Hitler as professional disagreement, not moral outrage. This way of thinking may have protected him during the war, allowing him to survive politically when others fell. But after the war, it trapped him. He could only defend himself within the limits of being a soldier, never admitting to what he may have known or ignored. By focusing on duty and discipline, Guderian built a shield that kept him safe, but also kept him silent. To readers, Panzer Leader feels like a man talking to himself, reasoning, justifying, and convincing himself that he had done what any good officer should. His words create a space between understanding and judgment, between explanation and excuse. That space is where his story becomes haunting. It's what makes historians question his honesty and what makes readers uneasy. His book isn't a confession. It's the voice of a man exhausted by what he cannot undo, clinging to professionalism because it's all he has left to define himself. When Panzer Leader first came out in 1950, and later in English in 1952, people were fascinated. Military experts saw it as a goldmine of insight into the German war machine, while historians saw it as a puzzle full of contradictions. On one hand, it offered detailed accounts of battles, command decisions, and tactics. On the other, it seemed to carefully reshape the past to make Guderian look better. Scholars compared his accounts with other records, war diaries, official reports, and the memoirs of other generals, and they began finding cracks in his story. Some timelines didn't match, certain meetings were described differently, and responsibility for failures often shifted conveniently away from him. Historians noticed how Guderian's version of events often simplified complex operations. He erased the voices of other commanders to make his own decisions stand out. Perhaps he thought that simplicity would make his story more believable. But for researchers, it suggested that he was choosing what to reveal and what to hide. He presented himself as a brilliant strategist surrounded by incompetence. When things went wrong, it was never his fault. It was always someone else's interference, usually Hitler's. That framing made Panzer Leader feel less like an honest memoir and more like a carefully written defense, designed to protect his legacy. Still, beneath his controlled tone, there are glimpses of real exhaustion. Moments where his precise language can't fully hide the weight of defeat. The most striking omission is his near-complete silence about war crimes. There's no mention of the suffering of millions, no acknowledgement of the crimes committed by the Wehrmacht, and no reflection on the ethical collapse of the regime he served. Instead, he fills his pages with strategy, planning, and movement, as if the war were a series of mechanical operations, not a human tragedy. This made the memoir both respected and controversial. It became an essential textbook for military strategy, but also a reminder of how easily history can be told without conscience. Still, even with its flaws, Panzer Leader was never dismissed. Its power lies in showing not just the facts of the war, but how one man wanted to be remembered. The errors and omissions don't erase its importance. They make it human. They show a man struggling to face his role in something far greater and darker than he could ever control. Over the years, Panzer Leader became a must-read in military academies around the world. Its lessons on mobility, coordination, and mechanized warfare shaped military thinking for decades. Yet historians agreed on one thing: it's not a reliable record of fact. It's a window into the mind of a man trying to write his own version of history before others did it for him. Guderian wasn't just describing battles. He was building a story about himself. A story where he was a thinker, not a follower, a strategist, not a soldier complicit in destruction. By the time Guderian finished writing Panzer Leader, he was an old man. The energy that had once driven him across Europe was fading. His memoir reads like the closing act of someone who knows his time is nearly over. 4 years after completing it, he died, leaving behind a book that would outlive him and continue to stir debate. Beneath his calm and calculated tone, you can sense the weariness of a man who has seen the cost of his own creation. In his final chapters, his confident voice begins to tremble with fatigue. The sharpness of his tactical analysis gives way to quiet moments of self-reflection. "I frequently cannot sleep at night," he wrote, describing how his thoughts circled endlessly around his soldiers, suffering in the freezing cold, hungry and without shelter. These are not the words of a general talking about victory. They are the words of a man haunted by what he saw. He admitted that he could no longer stay silent. Everything was falling apart, and no one would listen to him. The war was lost, but pride and denial blinded the leadership. His writing shifts from authority to despair. It's as if he realized too late that his genius for movement and strategy couldn't save a nation drowning in its own ideology. Historians now see these final passages as the closest Guderian ever came to recognizing the truth. He never openly admitted guilt, but his tone carries the weight of someone who finally understood that his brilliance had been used for destruction. Whether he failed to see the evil of Hitler's vision or chose not to see it, the result was the same. He obeyed. That obedience built his legend and destroyed his peace. In his last reflections, there's no celebration, no pride. The man who once dreamed of unstoppable speed was left recording collapse and confusion. His famous phrase about acting decisively now feels hollow, almost tragic. The unstoppable general had reached a point where he could only watch the ruins of his work. By the time he died in 1954, Panzer Leader had already become famous worldwide. It was both a technical masterpiece and a personal tragedy, a guide to warfare and a mirror reflecting the emptiness left behind by war itself. His last words in the book carry no bitterness, just exhaustion, the voice of a man trying to bring order to a world that had none. "I cannot stay silent anymore," he wrote, as if releasing himself from the burden he had carried for years. He had tried to create clarity in chaos, but in the end, even his disciplined mind couldn't control the truth. The war had been lost long before the final battles ended. What remained was only the aftermath, a mix of pride, regret, and unspoken guilt. That's what makes Panzer Leader so haunting. It's not just about history or tanks or strategy. It's about a man standing in the ruins of his own legacy, trying to convince the world, and himself, that he had done the right thing. In the end, Guderian's reflections remind us of a painful truth. Even the most intelligent, disciplined people can become trapped in the systems they help create. His brilliance changed the world, but his silence left questions that still echo today. Was he a visionary trying to survive in a corrupted regime, or a loyal officer who never questioned enough? Was he a hero of strategy or a man avoiding guilt? Perhaps he was both. His story forces us to face the uneasy space between genius and responsibility, between doing your duty and knowing when duty becomes wrong. Guderian left no clear answers, only the lingering tension of a man caught between obedience and remorse. And maybe that, more than anything, is why his final words still haunt history.